Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Yogahealer Podcast. I'm thrilled to be talking with Philip Stark of University of California at Berkeley. I came across you from talking with Sunny Savage, and she told me about a study that you ran on open source food, nutrition, toxicology, and availability of wild edible greens in the East Bay. I've had a very strong fascination on invasive weeds, on edible invasives as a global solution to nutrition. And I was just dying to talk to you about what prompted you to do this study, what you found in this study, and just to expose some of the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much. Sunny is terrific. She's really amazing. I'm grateful for the connection to you through her. So I got interested in foraging through long distance trail running. I just started to notice the plants around me. Have a lot of time to contemplate your navel or contemplate the environment as you're out there, and started to get curious about what the names of these plants were. Started noticing things blooming different times of year, and at some point I said, "Why do I care what it's called? What matters is what it's useful for." Food and medicine are, of course, two wonderful uses of plants, as well as fiber and other things, beauty. So once I clued into that, I started to nibble on things along the trail, and then at some point to stuff my running short pockets full of stuff for dinner. And at some point I turned it into a game. Can I learn a new edible species every week? Can I have something I foraged on my plate every day? And once your brain kind of clicks into this, because we're all really wired to be hunter-gatherers, we're really wired to scan our environment for resources this way, you start to see it everywhere. So I started to see these plants not just in what we normally think of as nature, but also in the built environment, in cities, along sidewalks, along roads, highways, in vacant lots, in my own front yard, in everybody else's yard. And realize this stuff really is everywhere, and in particular the non-native invasives that you're talking about. So the obvious question is, well, is it safe to eat? If you find it, say, along the sidewalk or growing next to asphalt or in someone's yard where there might have been a structure previously that had lead paint that had been bulldozed and something else built there, or it, in a mixed-use neighborhood that used to be a shipyard. There are all kinds of environments where there's all sorts of toxins in the soil. Near a highway where it's exposed to exhaust and brake dust and tire dust and all of these other things. So originally, when I got into this, I really had this kind of private, almost stingy feeling of ownership of the information. Like, this is my earthquake safety net. And I wasn't really sure that I wanted to share it with the rest of the world. But at some point it clicked that, if there really is a lot of this stuff out there and it's delicious and nutritious, then, there are people who are hungry today. There are people who are undernourished today. As an educator, it's an incredibly seductive idea to think that you can help people feed themselves by providing them information, right? That somehow what's missing is not the food itself. What's missing is the knowledge and recognition that it is food, and a little bit of information about how to prepare it, what parts are edible and so on. So I had an opportunity to put in a grant proposal with a couple of colleagues, Tom Carlson, who is an ethnobotanist, professor at UC Berkeley in integrative biology, and then later, Kristen Rasmussen DeVasquez joined us. She was a nutritionist at UC Berkeley and quite a talented chef, to start mapping the availability of these wild and feral edible foods in the East Bay, in the San Francisco region. And we decided that kind of the right approach was to look for places that were environmentally challenged and that didn't have ready access to fresh food. Because we could, if in places where, along highways or literally what used to be a shipyard and is now a mixed-use industrial and residential area, these plants were safe to eat, they should be safe to eat just about anywhere. And moreover, if they exist in abundance in those neighborhoods, then maybe they can have a meaningful impact on nutrition, food security, and food sovereignty and food equity and all of these things.
So when you're saying food wasn't available, you mean like there's not like grocery stores with fresh produce?
Yeah, no place to buy fresh produce. Yeah, one of the places had a food bank, which I guess has since closed. But yeah, no grocery store. Basically, you know, the kind of food would be available is what you find in a liquor store or convenience store, not a yeah. So we found lots and lots of food. We found that it was there pretty much year round, including the end of August in what was a 1,200-year record drought in California. So even under very harsh growing conditions, there was a lot of stuff there. We did a couple of kinds of nutrition and toxicology testing. In particular, we tested the soil for lead, cadmium, nickel, other heavy metals that pose a health risk. And then we went back to the places where the level of metals was highest in the soil and tested the plant tissue. So to see whether these plants were accumulating the metals and other things in their tissues. We did tests on dry tissue for metals, and we did tests on wet tissue for metals, as well as PCBs, herbicides in general, glyphosate specifically. And we did the wet tissue tests on about half a dozen species. The limitation was really budget. It costs a couple $1,000s a sample to run the nutrition panel and the toxicology testing on these things. So we're rather limited. But what we found was that if you just rinse these things like you're going to make a salad, the species we tested were safe to eat. They weren't accumulating the metals in their tissues. There was the level of herbicides and glyphosate in them was undetectable by the tests that we used. So the message was, at least for those species, at least in that season, at least in those places, because all of these things depend on soil chemistry and rain and all of the stuff, it was safe. So it's encouraging, but it's not definitive.
So how does that compare to conventional produce?
That's a really good question, and we haven't actually had the budget to do the same kind of tests on, lettuce from Safeway or something like that, but I would love to do that.
So no one else has either?
I'm not aware of any testing. I mean, I know that there are some tests for pesticide residues done in some places, but I don't know if there's any routine metals testing or anything else.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So what's next then with your information?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'd love to do more testing. I'd love to see whether this generalizes to other species and other places. There are certainly species that will accumulate nasty things in their tissues if they grow in a bad environment. Watercress is a classic example of that. Mm-hmm. There are also some brassicas that are used for phytoremediation of lead, that sort of take up lead out of the soil preferentially. My understanding is that typically you need to make the lead bioavailable by chelating it somehow. And typically you also have to deprive the plant of something else it wants, like phosphorus, to get it to take up the other metals. I don't know the extent to which that's true in practice. So more testing would be great. The other thing is where we're going to, changing people's behavior to get them interested in urban foraging is not an easy lift. Right. There are a lot of people who are so disconnected from the fact that food actually grows in soil or is part of an animal that they don't recognize the food as food unless it's on a grocery store shelf or on a plate in a restaurant or in a plastic bag. This was really brought home to me. I was visiting a farmer's market in Oakland in the Temescal district, and there was a vendor who was selling dandelion for $1.75 a bunch. You turn your head 90 degrees to the left, and there's an entire yard full of dandelion. Right? But it's not food because it's not in a plastic bag. Right? So I don't know how much effect we'll have on individuals at that level, but we can possibly have a lot more leverage with farmers and with chefs. A lot of these same plants grow accidentally between the rows of farms, organic farms, and conventional ones as well. The way that farmers relate to their weeds varies enormously, from waging war against them, literally using propane torches to burn them as they come up out of the ground, to, at the other extreme, embracing them as something that provides habitat for pollinators, provides a cover crop, not a crop per se, but at least some kind of ground cover, increases soil organic matter, has beneficial effects on soil chemistry, depending on exactly what it is that you're growing, and potentially can actually be used as either green manure or food for people, or forage for animals or something. So trying to understand how different farms relate to this, find farmers that have a happier relationship with their edible weeds and try to get them to bring them to market. And at the other end, working with chefs to try to remind them that there are these ancestral foods that are really pandigenous, that are delicious, nutritious, interesting, really greatly expand the biodiversity of our diets, with, everything that comes with that, from the benefits to the soil, the planet, and our own health, from just getting a greater diversity of nutrients, and different mouthfeel, different texture, different flavors, like all of these things that are really exciting for chefs. So we've been organizing an annual event. This was the 6th year of it, called Wild and Feral Food Week, which was to try to get weeds on plates around the world. So working with foragers and growers and chefs, and distilleries and other things that are probably not part of a good yoga practice. But anyway.
Well, they're all fermented, so it's all good.
There we go.
I would love, we'll put the link to that in the show notes, so I'll follow up to find out more about that, Wild and Feral. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, so the goal there, sorry.
Oh, where are we at in terms of understanding the nutritional complexes of these invasive edibles?
That's a hard question to answer, partly because I am really uncomfortable with the very Western reductionist view that all that matters in your food is a list of a dozen or 2 dozen nutrients that we've identified and isolated. I think that our bodies are much more complicated than that. Biology is much more complicated than that. And having a nutritional panel on something is really not a summary of whether it's good for you or not. I kind of think we should be eating whole foods to a great extent, and not things that come in plastic bags. That said, when we do side-by-side comparisons of the standard things you would see on a nutritional panel, these wild and feral foods compare very favorably to vegetables that we normally think of as extremely nutritious, like kale or spinach. They tend to have much higher level of fiber. Some have a higher level of protein. They have higher level of some of these phytochemicals and micronutrients, various minerals and whatnot. So they, on some level, are superfoods. There are reasons for this, ranging from the fact that the kind of selective breeding that humanity has done to produce agricultural crops, and especially our modern commercial row crops, has been to breed for a number of things. So one of them is yield, but yield is measured in pounds, not in flavor and not in nutrition. Another is breeding for shelf life, so that you can take a head of lettuce and truck it on ice across the country, or by rail car. Another is kind of palatability, but palatability tends towards bland and sweet rather than towards, interesting. And the combination of those things has actually inadvertently led to breeding a lot of the nutrition out of our food. Many phytonutrients are strongly flavored. A lot of things that are important for us are actually bitter. And, we as a culture tend to avoid bitter in our foods. Big exceptions are things like, coffee, tea, chocolate. But for the most part, radicchio in a regular grocery store is a relatively new thing. Endive, and our American palate kind of isn't there. A lot of these, wild and feral plants are harder to harvest in bulk. And when I've spoken to farmers about what are the obstacles to bringing more of this stuff to market, to getting it into the food supply, part of it is like, well, it's hard to harvest, 10 pounds of chickweed. And it's like, well, what if it wasn't 10 pounds of chickweed? What if it was 10 pounds of mixed, salad greens, wild salad greens, or 10 pounds of braising greens rather than having to get a whole bunch of one species? Would that help? Oh, I've had modest progress with this, but I'm still waiting for the home run.
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating to me because of being in the yoga world and the yoga industry for 20 years and seeing the rise of, and being part of the rise of like the green smoothie movement, and then seeing all these green powders. And I've talked to a number of farmers of like, can we get thistle? Can we get chickweed? Can we get lamb's quarter? Can we get amaranth into, I mean, because these supplements sell for, upwards of $30 to $60 for a couple of, honestly, ounces mixed in with a bunch of other fillers put in plastic containers and sold at Whole Foods. Yeah. And I've had like zero success in like figuring out there's free supply on one end. It doesn't need to be grown. It's growing.
Yep.
And how do we get it to, and it's just like what you were saying, like, how do we get it to market? I had, cause I have this global online community and we have these discussions quite frequently. And so my New Yorkers started to ask at their farmers market for things like lamb quarter and dandelion, and they were just talking directly to the farmers, and they got the farmers to actually bring them to the market. And it's like this, to me, like part of the solution is for at least a little percentage of the population is actually stimulating demand through regionalism, this through having stronger regional bonds to our food supply.
Yeah, I that's terrific. It's wonderful that your community is, letting the desires of consumers be known to the people who can supply stuff. It's really interesting. I mean, I'm not a farmer. I know it's a very, very difficult job, and I just only know a tiny little slice
farmers,
of,
we
of
love
how
you.
hard it is. Absolutely. The small and medium-sized farms. That said, many of these foods volunteer, as you mentioned, without requiring deliberate planting, without requiring deliberate water, fertilizer, anything else. They volunteer earlier in the season than many of the commercial crops do. So there's an opportunity for extra marginal revenue before your lettuce comes in. And many of them continue to produce longer in the season than the regular crops. There's still, the fennel seed coming up, whatever it is that's happening in August and September. So it seems like even if it's a whole lot easier in peak season to be harvesting your kale or your spinach or your lettuce, there are places around the ends where it could still add to revenue on farms and still be a way to, use cover crops not only for their ecological benefits, but also have economic cover crops that actually contribute directly to the revenue of the farm.
If I had $1 for every time I heard, I don't have the money, I'd be even more of a millionaire. People who become successful and even wealthy find the money to do what they most want. My Find the Money course is a super affordable course on how to find the money for the training and mentorship you want. We created this course at Yogahealer because I'd rather never hear, I don't have the money, from someone who wants to take a course from me or do anything else they deeply value. Those who can find the money get what they want in life. Finding the money for what you want is a skill in itself. Skills are not inborn talents. Rather, skills, including skills to find the money for the training and mentorship you want, can be broken into simple steps or behaviors to learn. Yogahealer's Find the Money course teaches you the step-by-step skills to raise the funds to do what you want to do and to be mentored by who you wish. If you want to check out my Find the Money course, go to yogahealer.com/find-the-money. As a podcast listener, you'll receive 65% off, which brings your investment to only $37. Go to yogahealer.com/find-the-money. I'd like you to find the money for whatever it is you most want to do. This is Kate Stillman with yogahealer.com.
You mentioned lamb's quarters. My girlfriend was, I think, at the is it Union Square Farmers Market in New York? Yeah, seeing lamb's quarters for $24 a pound in something like March or April. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah. It's exciting. So if we go back to your study, like I want to know a little bit about the species, and then also about like, why do you think these species don't pick up the toxins in the soil? Like why, like how does that whole thing work? Pure speculation is fine.
Yeah, it is going to be speculation. So I don't have a list of the species we tested off the top of my head. It is in that paper in PLOS One. I think I sent you the link. But we did, oxalis was one of them. Dandelion was certainly one of them. I think sow thistle was one, maybe cat's ear, nasturtium, a few other things. So we are not the first people to find that these plants are not phytoaccumulating in urban environments. The first study of this kind that I was aware of was done in Boston on behalf of there's like a Boston Canning Society, and I can't think of his name right now, the professor at Wellesley who does soil testing, ecological things, but one of the members of the Boston Canning Society showed up with high levels of lead in his or her blood. And the concern became, did this happen because they were foraging these fruits in an urban environment? And they collected samples of fruits and some, more weed-like things, vegetable things that they had been foraging. And he ran the testing on this and didn't find accumulation of anything that would have accounted for the levels of lead in this person's blood. There's also been a study in Germany and a study in Italy. Interestingly, I think the study in Italy found higher levels of metals further away from roads than closer to roads in the plants. But again, the only thing we found where the level of something in the plant was potentially of concern was a wild lettuce that was accumulating cadmium, but you would still have had to eat like a kilogram of dried wild lettuce a day before it would have become an issue, like just crazy stuff. And the wild lettuce is punishingly bitter. So it's not something you'd be eating a lot of. So why aren't they accumulating? Well, I mean, my guess is the plants don't really have a biological use for it. And they may not even have, a chemical pathway to pick it up. And so, why would the plant, be accumulating this if it doesn't actually have a need for it? And my other intuition would be that somehow the further up the plant you go, the less likely you are to have a problem. By the time you get to talking about the fruit of something, it's probably much, less worrisome than the leaves, and maybe the roots or something are more of an issue. But that's complete speculation. I don't have no testing to back that up.
Yeah. So are part of the reason these plants are surviving in such, in soil where native plants won't is because of the taproot? Or is there other factors? And
they have a lot of strategies for thriving in environments that other plants don't. To some extent, they really evolved to fill that particular ecological niche. So I should mention also a couple of things you just reminded me of. So one is that some of these phytochemicals are the kind of the plant's immune system or the plant's defense mechanisms, and they may produce more of these chemicals when they're stressed than when they're not. And plants that are growing in kind of natural environments will typically end up subject to other stresses that are quite different from something that's growing agriculturally, where it gets plenty of water and plenty of nutrients and so forth. So that's borne out by our testing in that we compared forage dandelion to farmed dandelion, and the nutrient density of the forage stuff was like double. I think it had 2.5 times as much iron, or more fiber, other things like that. So it's kind of babying a plant isn't good for it in some sense.
That's just so phenomenal. Like that's because you're talking about like cultivated soil that's getting nutrients added to it versus Oakland.
Yeah, pretty much. So I got kind of lost track of your question in my ramble. I apologize, but
just about how the plants are surviving better than natives.
Surviving, right? Yep. So
or thriving. I mean, because they're spreading seeds like crazy. They're everywhere.
Yeah. So there's, when you say like, what is a weed? What makes a weed a weed? Oh, there are kind of glib definitions that say a weed is, a plant whose virtues aren't yet recognized, or a plant growing someplace where it isn't wanted, or something like that. But there are actually biological characteristics of weeds. One of them is that they tend to get to a point of making seed relatively early in their maturity, so that if something happens to them, they can still propagate. They tend to be promiscuous in how they are pollinated. They may be able to self-pollinate, have insects pollinate them, have birds, like more than one mechanism for reproducing. They may be able to reproduce easily vegetatively from a root fragment or something else. You take a hoe to dandelion and you get 6 dandelion instead of no dandelion, right? So they, some of them will only germinate on bare ground. So they know that they don't have a lot of competition. Some of them will, very quickly put out a basal rosette that will put shadow, will kind of smother other things and put shadow on to keep them from germinating. Some of them have various, will actually exude various chemicals into the grounds from their roots that will prevent other plants from germinating. So they have all kinds of strategies for thriving, and they thrive kind of specifically, they really evolved along with agriculture in many cases. It's like preparing the ground by tilling whatever creates this opportunity, brings seed up to the surface, provides bare ground, does all of these things. It's like, something that can take advantage of that environment, can really thrive. And a number of our crops, originated as agricultural weeds, and have now become legitimate crops. And I don't have a list on the top of my head, but I think lettuce and rye are two examples of that. Yeah. So it's a niche, and we created it. So.
Well, I think this is really a super fascinating point. I'm not sure if you've read Katrina Blair's work on the wisdom of wild weeds and the 13 weeds that are found in all. Yeah, she's phenomenal on this topic, and she actually is the chef forager. She set up a little restaurant of forage foods in Colorado. She got her county to be a no spray county, and they found that actually just using basically a decoction of like thistle and spraying that on thistle helped the natives repopulate. I mean, she's an amazing experimenter.
Well, I think I might have seen YouTube video for stuff.
She's this amazing, delicate human being who just lives off wildcrafting and teaches the people. So her belief is that, these weeds are exactly what human need. In terms of even like where we're nutrient deficient is what these invasives that you're studying in Oakland and like these really polluted neighborhoods are here to save us, are here to actually like replenish our blood deficiencies, to give us deep nutrification, and to help us see basically the whole Gaia principle of like, hey, we're all in this together. We're in this with the weeds. There's a reason the weeds are everywhere. To your point, the more we disturb the soil, the more certain species take advantage of it. These species happen to be survivors, thrivers in their environment. They produce a ton of protein, of different nutrient complexes. But more than that, they're here, they're available.
They are.
They're better than we get in the store.
They're a resource. Yeah, my colleague, Tom Carlson, sort of says, if you can't beat them, eat them.
Right? It's the best strategy.
So I would almost flip what she said on its head, which is to say there's pretty good evidence that the biodiversity of the plants in our diet is an incredibly strong predictor of our health. And when we were hunter-gatherers, we didn't eat, enormous quantities of one thing, season in, season out, year in, year out, right? You eat what's there, and you're picking small amounts of a bunch of different things. And it's not surprising that we need little bits of this stuff. And what has changed is not, kind of our need for it. What's changed is what we're getting supplied with. So as we've narrowed down increasingly the number of species that we're eating, it's not surprising that we have deficiencies that could be addressed by broadening the biodiversity of our diets. So, you know, it's really kind of a self-inflicted deficiency disease, if you will.
Totally. In Ayurveda medicine, which is my background, it's very clear on like the human palate is relative. There's 6 tastes: sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter, and astringent. The best nutrients are in bitter and astringent. You need a little bit of pungent too if you want to have a strong immune system. That the bitter and the pungent, the hot and the cold are what helps us kill viruses. It helps us strengthen our overall just resilience and immunity, and it really broadens our palate, you know, just like you're talking about broadening like the different types of species that we're eating. We get that broadening of taste through those different species and the different seasons and our connection to ecosystem, and even being able to, like you've found trail running, being able to see and to notice and to become connected to and curious about the ecosystem. In Ayurveda, there's also a fable around this group of new physicians, like newly minted physicians, and their teacher says the final test is to go find a plant that's not a medicine. And the only there's like 100 students. They all trickle back. Oh, I found the plant. I found the plant. I found the plant. They all fail, and only one comes back and says, I couldn't find one.
You couldn't find one. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And it's like, it's about the quantity. It's about the amount, right? Of like, of what plant and what season for what condition. And
when, what part of the plant and how you prepare it and all of these things. Yeah. Kind of change.
So I'm just curious in your thinking, because I know from other, you know, just reading a little bit about your bio, like you think big. The number of different studies that you've done, and you know, the seismic structure of sun and earth, like you're obviously a huge universal thinker. What is your sense with these wild edible invasives and just like the amount of like protein content and nutrition content that's just like the biomass? I just bought a piece of property. It's partly native and then partly been farmed and has tons of invasives in it. And we were clearing out some of the thistle. I have more thistle than I can harvest. And so we were clearing out some of the thistle, and I brought the 2 teenage next door neighbors with me to help me out. And we just ended up with this huge pile of biomass. And I kept saying like this is fuel in some countries. It's nutrition, and in other, you know, it's
fiber.
Right. There's so much biomass. There's so much nutrient density. There's so much in this pile that we're going to let decompose and turn into dust.
So, I mean, a few thoughts. One is there's a reason that agriculture, that we developed agriculture. I mean, it really is easier to have a reliable food supply, feed a lot of people, if you plant things deliberately. And some species are more productive than others, and some species, you know, we get along better with some species than others. I don't think that we, you know, would do very well going back to being a society of hunter-gatherers. You know, that said, you know, as you say, there's a ton of this stuff there, and rather than wage war against it, you know, it's delicious, it's nutritious, it's free, at least, you know, but for the labor of harvesting it and processing it. So, you know, why isn't this part of the solution? Conversely, when we look at what's happening with climate change, it's clear that agriculture needs to change. But I mean, let's forget about the fact that agriculture is one of the big drivers of climate change itself, through its fossil fuel use, changes in land use, all of these other things. But just, you know, as the climate extremes become more extreme, as the planet generally warms, what are we going to do to feed ourselves? So there's a lot of people who think the solution is GMOs, CRISPR, and things like that. And we're going to take this, you know, few dozen species that you find in the grocery store and tweak them in this way and that to let them, you know, thrive at higher temperatures and so forth. Here's another alternative. Why don't we look at the plants that succeed in a wide variety of circumstances that don't require a lot of water, that don't require a lot of fertilizer? We really kind of want our agricultural crops to be more weed-like. And we have these edible weeds that already grow up with agriculture. Maybe what we should be thinking about doing is kind of shifting the balance between how much of this you allow to grow or deliberately cultivate and how much of that you deliberately cultivate. And that we may find a lot more resilience for ourselves, for the planet, for our food supply, if we embrace these things as the legitimate foods that they have been for 20,000 years, or more.
Awesome. So in closing, any way that you think people listening can become part of the solution, or tips for becoming just more informed or active?
Well, think globally, forage locally. I don't know. I think that what will make this work or not work for a given individual is whether they take delight in it, whether they get curious about their environment. Something you were saying before reminded me that this is a way to really have a sense of home and a sense of place. Like, what does it mean to feel at home somewhere? Well, we're human beings, right? We have biological needs. We need to feed ourselves. If you can go someplace and actually recognize food in your environment, that's much more a sense of home than, you know where to go buy groceries, right? So this kind of really knowing a place and really being part of it and really, eating your environment's microbiome and eating what the environment has to offer and eating what is peak right now, this season, this week, this day, that just, it's an incredible feeling of connectedness. It's, some of the moments of feeling, most human in my life are kind of moving along, scanning the environment, just like, people would have done dozens of generations ago, looking for what's there. And I think really getting in touch with your inner naturalist and taking responsibility for your food in this way, rather than the kind of infantilization that we've done now for generations, where we need someone to feed us, right? It feels incredibly good.
Amen to that. I'm so thrilled to be able to tap into your wisdom and the study. And what are you working on next?
Oh gosh, most of my time right now is actually occupied with election integrity, trying to prepare for the presidential election. I do a lot of work on how to audit the vote to make sure that the machines really tabulated the votes accurately and everybody's vote counted. But that's probably the biggest thing on my plate right now.
Awesome. Thanks for doing the good work.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, you too.